So basically, these are going to be the 4 best decks across the board, and then 1 deck that's good specifically for higher rating, and then 2 decks that are good specifically for kind of lower rating and people on a budget, because I do know that a lot of people are in that category of the people that watch my videos. So the first deck, by far, best deck in the game, played it about 80 times with an almost 70% win rate over the course of those games. Murloc Paladins, absolutely absurd. Definitely there is counterplay. Some of the big cards that have counterplay are Zephyrus, but also a card that not a lot of people use yet, but I could definitely see people using, and it's the Waste Warden. If people start running this card a little bit more, I feel like Murloc Paladin could be in a bit of trouble. 3 damage deals with all of the 2 pumped health Murlocs, so if you are seeing a lot of Murloc Paladin, tech in a Waste Warden or 2. I could definitely see this card being very, very good into this matchup, especially if your class lacks some removal. So like if you're seeing a lot of this as say like a rogue player, throwing in a Waste Warden or 2 might actually be a pretty good plan, but you have to start seeing a lot of Murlocs for this to actually work. If you're seeing a lot of Totem Shamans too, Waste Warden could be good. So this is a card, just extra point of information for you guys, extra little tip. Waste Warden is going to be a really good tech, at least to be like for the last couple of weeks as these decks rise in popularity a little bit more. But Murloc Paladin is a pretty simple deck. You kind of just run at them. You kind of just play on curve. You try to hope for a 1-drop. Ideally not Toxfin, then hope for a 2-drop. Maybe pump up one of your 1-drops, and then pump them up more with Cold Light Seer, and then pump those up more with Felfin Navigator, and then play weapons to control the board while keeping your minions healthy and going face. And that's basically it. Eventually, you have a ton of card draw with Octosari. If you don't have Octosari, you can run a Salhit's Pride. It is a lot worse in terms of card draw, but it is cheaper and not a bad card at all. So if you want to do it, you can run this card. If you don't have Octosari, Scale Rider is fairly important. Some people ask me, can I run the Righteousness for this instead of this? I'd say absolutely not. Righteousness is a bad card. It basically will do the same thing, but you don't get a 5/6 body on top of it. Like a 5/6 is already really strong on its own. With an ability like this card is absolutely necessary for the deck. It's one of those late game cards that closes out games. This card is so important. I will say that this deck does kind of require Murgle. The Prime is a late game option. It's your only late game option really other than Octosari, but you don't need Octosari. And then Scale Lord, you kind of need. If you absolutely can't run it, run an extra Henchclan Hogsteed, maybe an extra Toxfin, and or Never Surrender to protect your minions a bit. And that's about it. This deck is fantastic overall. I've seen people say that they run it completely on a budget with neither of the legendaries and neither of the Scale Lords and still have like a 60% plus win rate with it because they run another Never Surrender, a Toxfin, a Henchclan, and then they also run a Pride, and they've had success. So 100% try this deck out. The next deck is Highlander Hunter. Highlander Hunter is a very, very solid deck in its own right. You could definitely run some different iterations of the build. Some people run a slightly a faster option or a faster style. I have actually now opted for that. I took out Dragon Queen Alexstrasza in the Grand Slam. I do think Alexstrasza is still good, but it's more of a value card now that you want to run in a deck like Warlock or Mage or something slow like Priest that is meant to control and get value. Whereas Hunter, you want early game, you want tempo, you want to do damage, and Alexstrasza, now being in total 11 mana, no longer fits that bill. But I do think Highlander Hunter is still extremely good. If you're playing into Murloc, always keep the stupid Zephyrus right at the beginning of the game so you can get the Hungry Crab. And cards like Desert Spear and Rush Minions to control the board. And if you're playing into most other decks, just keep tempo. Just try to keep some 1 and 2 drops. This deck now has 1 extra 1-drop and 1 extra 2-drop instead of Alexstrasza and the Grand Slam, which has helped the consistency of this deck. And I think I'm like 14-8 with this deck recently, so it's pretty solid. I would recommend this one personally. Do I think it's absurd? No. I think it's like Murloc Paladin is way up here, and then like a decent gap, and then there's Highlander Hunter. Like, it's not like one and then immediately the next one. There's like a decent gap, not huge, not insurmountable, but like a decent gap, and then Highlander Hunter. The next deck is Bomb Warrior. There are 2 ways to play Bomb Warrior. There's this way with the burst combo with Grommash and Bloodsworn Mercenary, Corcoran Elite, Inner Rage, and Rampage. I personally like this one because with the Inner Rage and Rampage, it allows you to develop boards relatively quickly, especially if you're able to play a Warmeld Challenger early into something like a Druid. If you're able to play that relatively early on, or even just an Armor Smith and then Inner Rage, Rampage it, and make it a 6/6 the next turn. It can just develop you a board relatively quickly, and the burst potential is pretty nice, and people can't really play around it. But I will say that there is this bomb control version. Both of them will be in the description, by the way. This doesn't, I'm not counting this as an entirely different deck, by the way. I'm including both versions of Bomb Warrior as one deck. Because they're similar in style, it's just one has a burst combo to finish, and the other one just runs more bombs with extra Clockwork Goblins, a Horde Pillager for an extra inch caliber, and some extra removal with Bladestorm and Brawl. I think that they're both very similar. Also, your closer isn't burst, it's Galakrond. Just fun fact. No invokes, it's just you hero power every single turn and get one extra card draw, which can be nice. This one's run a lot slower. You have a lot more removal. You basically focus on controlling the board. Say, like, into an aggro deck, this one would probably do better. But into, say, a slower deck, it does a little bit worse, in my opinion. Because even though you get to constantly hero power, if you play against a warrior or a priest or even a mage, once they get a lot of freezing and minions going and get some taunts out there, it's very hard to finish them off without the burst potential. So it kind of depends on what you're going for. I think both decks are pretty solid in their own right. It just depends on if you want consistent damage at the end to maybe finish them off and chip away with some extra bombs, or if you want to just burst them down with some sort of combo. I think bomb control might be a little bit better. It's definitely more played than the version I use, but I think it might be a little bit better, but I do think that they're very, very, very close, just overall. Also, if you see a lot of early game, you could definitely try to see if you can run a Sword board as well, because that's very good at dealing with early game aggro. Next deck is, where is Quest Warlock? Boom, Quest Warlock. I think this and Galakrond Warlock are fairly close, but I think that Quest Warlock is just a little bit better because you have the OTK potential, and you have the potential to get like a ton of value for absolutely nothing. But I think that Galakrond Warlock is making its way up and is definitely a viable deck to play. Like, for sure, it's definitely viable. Only reason why I like Quest Warlock a little bit more is, again, because of the fact that you have a little bit more healing, it looks like. So you have, in my opinion, a slightly better matchup into some aggro decks. But you're not very proactive. You kind of just wait to finish your quest and then try to burst them down. But it's a very solid deck. I would highly recommend it. The reason why I put it near the bottom, though, is because its skill cap is really high. You'll need to know when to commit to things, when to plot twist, when you can life tap, and when you have to stop life tapping or else you'll die, and things like that. And I think Galakrond Warlock is a little more forgiving on that front because you play more minions, so you have more board pressure. So if you want an easier to play Warlock deck that's similar in playstyle, more controlled with some late game power, I would say go with Galakrond Warlock. I actually took out Dragon Queen Alexstrasza and put in the Evasive Draconoid, and I actually think that it was a pretty decent buff because now you don't lose nearly as hard to aggro decks, because you actually have another playable card turn 7. Because Galakrond, you're usually not going to play turn 7, so that leaves you just Seamat. It gives you a whole other option, and it keeps Dragon Synergy. So ever since putting in this card, I haven't played that many games. I think I played 4, and I was 3-1 with it. So I highly recommend playing it with this card instead of Dragon Queen Alexstrasza. And I think that Galakrond Warlock and Quest Warlock are very similar. I think Quest Warlock has slightly higher potential because there are more combos and stuff with it, but Galakrond Warlock in its own right is very, very strong, and is a little simpler to play because it's more minion focused. Again, similar to Bomb Warrior, I'm going to put both of them in the description, and let's just jump into the next one. The reason why I'm combining them is because they are fairly similar in playstyle, with some key differences which I described, but for the most part, should be relatively similar to play. So if you can play one, you'll probably be able to play the other. If you can play Quest Warlock, you can play this one. If you can play this one, it'll take a little bit of a learning curve, but you can play Quest Warlock as well later on. And now we will get into the deck that is good for higher ranks specifically. That is Highlander Mage. Highlander Mage has a high skill cap, I would say, a decent amount of RNG, and you have to know how to control the board and what to mulligan and stuff like that. But I think that this deck is absolutely phenomenal. I think that this deck is one of the decks that I've had a pretty surprising amount of success on. I didn't think Mage would be very good after the nerfs to Dragoncaster and Alexstrasza, but the deck definitely still holds up quite well. It has a lot of extra win conditions. It has a lot of late game. Like, if you just look at it, not even including the Prime or Zephyrus, it's got 9 cards 7+, and 3 cards that are 6 as well, with some of the 6-cost cards being like Reno, which are big win conditions. But if you just look at this late game roster, from 7 down, and then also including Zephyrus and the Prime, this deck's late game is probably some of the best in the game, unless you get bursted by like a Quest Warlock with an OTK. Right? Like, this deck is crazy strong, and I would highly recommend it. It's a bit of a learning curve. It's a bit expensive, and I wouldn't, again, recommend crafting any of these decks from scratch with the new expansion coming out. I would say just save your dust and wait to see. But if you have these cards lying around, or at least a decent chunk of them, like if you're missing a couple of them, maybe it's not that bad. You could probably find some replacements. But if you have these cards lying around, I would definitely try out this deck for that last little bit of climbing before the new expansion drops. Now, I have 2 more decks. These are for more budget players at lower ranks because it really, really capitalizes on bad play from the opponent. And the first one is Totem Shaman. Basically, if they don't kill a totem on a certain turn and you're able to duplicate it, you can run away with games, and people don't know how to respond to it. At higher ranks, even at higher ranks, I'm like 65% win rate with this over the course of about 20 games. I think I'm 13-7. Yeah, it sounds about right. I think I'm 13-7 with this deck, which isn't amazing because it's a small-ish sample size, but it definitely can still work 100%. And I do think that this deck, especially at lower ranks, can capitalize on bad play. If you don't have Vicina, you can run another Bloodlust, by the way. There's no problem. Or another card that people have been telling me I should run that I haven't yet, but I've definitely considered, is actually the Portal. I think this 3-drop or this 3-mana card that deals 3 damage and gets you a 3-cost card could either A, replace Lava Burst, or B, replace some other card in here, like maybe a Bloodlust or Vicina. Maybe Vicina. Like, if you don't have the Legendary, you could definitely run this Portal. It would be perfectly fine. Maybe get rid of the 1 Aug Merchant for a Portal as well. I could see this card being very, very good. I haven't personally run it, but if you want to try it out, go on ahead. But basically, this deck punishes people's lack of priority of killing a totem. Because sometimes they'll probably think, oh, he's probably going Galakron Warlock or Galakron Shaman because Totem Shaman isn't super popular. So they won't necessarily deal with your totem immediately. They won't like commit removal to it. And then boom, you totem reflection it. You get 2/2/4s with an ability depending on what you have. And then they're like, oh shoot, now you have a lot of pressure on board. The next turn you splitting axe and the board is just snowballed from there and it's insane. So yeah, that is about it with this one. This deck is just pretty solid all around. It punishes bad play. If you play correctly and you have some good tempo, you can definitely run away with games extremely easily with this deck. And I personally, in Legend, have a 65% win rate with it. And then the last one is Zoo Warlock. Zoo Warlock, I haven't played a ton yet. Okay, keep that in mind. I am slightly... This one doesn't have as huge of a sample size as I would like it to have. I think I've played it like 15 times. I think I'm like 9-6. So definitely not outstanding, but it has 1 legendary, which is Zephyrus, and you don't even really need him. I mean, he's a great closer, but if you want to run another direct damage spell, like maybe Drain Life or something to do a little bit of extra direct damage to his face, it's probably fine. Although I do think Zephyrus is an amazing card all around, and if you don't have him, you should definitely craft him because he's useful in a lot of other decks. So you have 1 legendary that you should already have. You have 1 epic in the Magic Carpet, and then Transfer Students free because everyone got it because of the new expansion. So it's got like 1 epic and 1 legendary, and that's it. That's pretty much it. And the legendary everyone should have. And the point is, it's a cheap deck. It's very effective. The only legendary it has is a deck a card everyone should already have, and it has 1 epic card. But I could see this epic card being useful in some other forms of aggro decks as well, potentially. But especially useful in Zoo Warlock. And I think that this deck looks like it could be really, really strong. especially later on when you're able to play cards with the new card that's being released. So basically, every time you play a minion, it dies and becomes a 4/4. Magic Carpet won't necessarily be as good in that deck after that point because the cards will be 4/4s for 4 probably. But you have enough 1-drops to where the deck will get buffed by that and the 8/8 that changes every time you take damage because you life tap a decent amount. You'll probably get to play an 8/8 for say like 4 or 5 mana, maybe even less. So both of those cards being added will be a big buff. I can see them replacing Transfer Student. Thank you so much for the follow. I cannot see your name, but I appreciate it. Yeah, this deck's going to get buffed with the new cards being released as well. Also, the eggs, if you want to try to put that in there. So, there are a lot of different things like I could see this deck being good with the next expansion coming out. But even right now, the deck's pretty solid. I'm 9-6 with it. You just flood the board. You look for 1-drops. You look for Imprisoned Scrap Imp. You just try to snowball the board, do damage as quickly as you can, and then close out the game with a Soulfire and or Zephyrus at the end. And that's pretty much it. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this tier list. These decks are all the best decks that I personally have played and personally endorse. And I hope you guys have a fun time climbing before this new expansion, because this is the last month before a whole ton of new cards drop. And then we're going to be super hyped for that, and I'll come out with a tier list for that as well later. I'll also probably, if you're interested, tell me if you're interested in what I think will be top tier decks when the expansion actually drops. As like a prediction, because I can definitely try to do that as well, but since it's all just like speculation, if you don't want to see that, I totally understand. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. This is great. If you want to support me, please subscribe. Don't be part of the 75% of people that aren't, because subscribing is the best way to support me, boost my algorithm. You watch it a little bit more consistently because it gets recommended a bit more, and it's just super helpful to me. So I hope you guys enjoyed. See ya.